seriously, whatever their views. I draw the House's attention to the guidance on rules of behaviour and courtesies in the House of Commons. A new version for this session is now available, clarifying these areas. Criticism of members. In this place, we are honourable members, and the language we use about each other should reflect that. If a member falls short of the standards expected of us all, there are ways of dealing with that, but not by accusations made by sideswipes during questions or debates. If we fail to treat each other with the respect in debate, that diminishes our work, but it also risks raising the temperatures of discussions outside this place, particularly on social media, which already too often descend into online abuse against honourable members. Confidentially, of the Speaker's correspondence with members. And I've got to say to members, please, it's so important that honourable members are able to raise matters with me freely. And for that reason, I keep such correspondence confidential. This includes applications for urgent questions. I remind members it is equally important that my responses, particularly on matters of privilege, are treated with the same respect. And I just hope that certain members are listening to that. Speaking in the Chamber, I also wish to give some advice about seeking to speak within the Chamber. The Deputy Speakers and I take into account the number of factors when determining a number of which we call, during business, that it is not balloted. And one factor we consider carefully is how often members speak. In other words, if you spoke much more than a colleague, then other things may be equal, that colleague is more likely to be called, or certainly more likely to be called earlier, especially in the next debate for which you both apply. I know, and I do stress this. Oh, don't worry, I'm coming to him. I do know that it can be frustrating not to be called in a debate or to be called very late. And that frustration may continue. But to put it on Twitter is not a good way that it would be called early. Because can I just say, by doing that, my response is that I can't take you early because you've already told the world that you've not been taken. So think carefully before you use Twitter as an example to try and intimidate the Speaker. So, of course, prioritising debates, question times, urgent questions and statements in which you seek to participate is one way of trying to avoid the happening. Now that we have started a new session, everybody's scores start. After the reset button, it starts at 0. And that even includes Jim Shannon. And I shall make it clear that different principles apply to the front benches. And I think I've got to remind that when people do counting scores, the front benches of the three largest parties were nominated to speak on behalf of their parties. So staff in my office are happy to offer advice on how we can help others. Now let us come to something very important. Not that the other hasn't been, but the security and safety. Finally, I want all members and everyone in the parliamentary community to be able to go about their work safely, both online and here in Westminster. The security of this building and those who work here depends on all of us. We have a duty to be vigilant and to assist those whose job it is to maintain this place as a safe place of work. So please, yes, we are members of Parliament. Yes, of course, we're elected to be here. But just to remember, those who carry out the security duties here are doing it to ensure that we're all safe. So please, try not to abuse them, and you shouldn't abuse them, let me say that. And do not take advantage of your position. So before moving to the first business of the new session, I'd like to express my very best wishes to all honourable members and to all those who work in this House. And I've got to say, thank you to the staff of this House. Yeah. Whether it's the security, wherever we are, they're looking after us. So please, just realise they've a job to do. And I've got to say thank you to all the catering staff, because without them, we couldn't function. But thank you. Right, Clark, Overseas Bill.
Outlawries Bill.
I have to acquaint the House that this House, as this day attended, His Majesty's in the House of Peers, and that His Majesty was pleased to make a most gracious speech from the throne to both Houses of Parliament, of which I have, for greater accuracy, obtained a copy. I shall direct that the terms of the speech be printed in the votes and proceedings. Copies are available in the vote office. Before I call the mover and seconder, I want to announce that the proposals subjects of debate during the remaining days of the Royal Address are: today, debate on the address; tomorrow, breaking down barriers of opportunity; Thursday, making Britain a clean energy superpower; Monday, building an NHS fit for future; Tuesday, securing high sustained economic growth in every part of the country; Wednesday, reducing violent crime and raising confidence in policing and the criminal justice system. So I now have the pleasure to call Sir Robert Goodwill to move, and then I will call Sir Bon Bailey to second the address.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon. I beg to move that an humble address be presented to His Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. It is a great honour to move the humble address. This is the first time that King Charles has opened the session as monarch. So today's pomp and ceremony is tinged with sadness as we remember the late Queen with affection and gratitude for 70 years of service to our kingdom and Commonwealth. We look forward to another significant reign as the baton has passed to the next generation. So, Mr. Speaker, it's finally come to this. It's official. I was the future once. The seconder of the humble address, the Honourable Member for Stroud, for whom I'm the warm-up act today, is always described as up and coming, and I'm not really sure what that makes me. I recall on the last occasion the member for Beverley and Holderness was proposing the humble address, and we all thought he was on the scrap heap. But less than 2 months later, he was back on the front bench attending Cabinet, so you never know. Although the Chief Whip has assured me there's no danger of that happening to me. Now, Scarborough and Whitby has got to be the best constituency in the country. It has, of course, Mr. Speaker, a head start by being in Yorkshire. They say you should never ask someone if they're from Yorkshire, because if they are, they're bound to mention it in the first 5 minutes. And if not, why humiliate them unnecessarily? But I'm very pleased to see our colleagues in the SNP sporting the white rose of Yorkshire. Although I must point out... I must point out Yorkshire Day is the 1st of August. Not for the first time they've got things wrong. Now, the arrival of the railways created Scarborough as our first seaside destination, and we are still Britain's premier coastal resort, second only to London in number of visitors. In fact, there could be more if some of the £36 billion recouped from HS2 could be redeployed on duelling the A64. Culturally, we're the home of Sir Alan Ayckbourn and also the birthplace of the McCain oven chip. As well as Plaxton's coaches and the electric buses we are increasingly seeing on our streets in places like Blackpool. That is, if the Labour Council there don't order Chinese ones. Whitby is famous for Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Goth Weekend, and of course fish and chips from the famous Magpie restaurant. Not the only place you can get good fish and chips in Whitby, I hasten to add. Before mass tourism, the area was dotted with ironstone, alum and jet mines. Fast forward a century or two, and we're now the biggest mining area in the country, with Anglo-American investing £1 million every single day, employing around 1,000 people developing the new polyhalite mine just outside Whitby, with its 23-mile connecting tunnel to Teesside, where Mayor Ben Houchen is delivering so much economic development. Yeah. The North Yorkshire Moors National Park, made famous as the location of Aidensfield in ITV's Heartbeat police drama, is home to many important ground nesting birds on the heather moorlands, sustained and managed in traditional ways by generations of farmers and keepers. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, Mr. Speaker, but we seem to be having a lot of by-elections at the moment. Not so fast. And it was a by-election in Rydale in 1986 that whetted my appetite for frontline politics. The seat was held with a thumping 16,000 Conservative majority, but fell to the Liberals, with a 19% swing giving Elizabeth Shields a 5,000 vote margin. Not for long. While the rest of the Liberal Party were going back to their constituencies to prepare for government, I wasn't going to put up with the situation, so rather naively, I put my name forward, along with 200 others, to be the candidate at the subsequent general election. I wasn't selected, but did come second to John Greenway, who, in case members don't remember, in some cases weren't even born. I'm looking at the member for Selby over there somewhere. Won the seat back only 13 months later with a 10,000 majority. The moral is, don't count your chickens on the basis of by-election results. Not put off, my next move was to try and find a safe Labour seat to fly the flag for Margaret Thatcher. Living in the North East, there was no shortage of rock-solid Labour citadels. Places like Sedgefield, Hartlepool, Bishop Auckland, North West Durham, or Redcar. And so it was in Redcar I was selected to challenge the wonderful Mo Mowlam. By then, by the way, John Major had taken over from Mrs Thatcher. And I can remember when that happened, my children coming up to me to ask, "Daddy, is it really possible that a man can be Prime Minister?" We have now had 3 women Conservative premiers, assuming the most recent one counts, of course. And we now have the first Prime Minister who represents a Yorkshire seat. Is that a big deal? Yes, it certainly is. I must say that the Right Honourable Member for Richmond could not have been a better neighbour nor a better friend for me. Now, Labour were well ahead in the polls in the run-up to the 1992 election, and Mo actually had a car at the count with the engine running, ready to take her down to sit in Neil Kinnock's cabinet as Northern Ireland Secretary. But once again, the polls are wrong. I stood in North West Leicestershire in the 1997 Blair landslide election, which I think I will quickly pass over. Suffice it to say that both seats where I stood, both Redcar and in Leicestershire, eventually returned Conservative members. Yeah. I like to think that the goodwill effect was a slow burn. After what I will call a 5-year sabbatical in the European Parliament, I was selected for Scarborough and Whitby, a seat that had been consistently blue since 1918, but had been red in both 1997 and 2001. Even though the exit polls said I would lose, we managed to prevail on the 5th of May 2005, and I entered the House at last. Yeah. I would put our victory down to one deciding factor. On the eve of poll, of all the places Tony Blair could have chosen for his big election rally, he chose Scarborough. Maybe the Leader of the Opposition could indulge me next time round and come to Scarborough on the eve of poll to see if he can replicate the Blair effect. Or better still, have a rally in Sheffield and go the full Kinnock. At the following election, I was the victim of a fly poster campaign. All over town there were A4 photocopies asking the question, what is the difference between Robert Goodwill and a supermarket trolley? The local newspaper picked up on this and concluded that a supermarket trolley has a mind of its own. I must admit that I've never voted against the Tory whip, so that might explain it. However, having been here a while, I can now reveal the real answer to the question. The difference between an MP and a supermarket trolley is that there is a physical limit to the amount of food and drink you can get into a supermarket trolley. Now, I certainly welcome the bills that have been announced. In particular, I would like to see convicted criminals attend their sentencing. Yeah. Life for some of the most severe crimes must mean life too. Yeah. Fairness is part of what it means to be British, and we must ensure that the dynamic between freeholders and leaseholders is intrinsically fair, in the same way as we should show equal respect for landlords and tenants when they're doing the right thing. I was pleased to see the ban on live animal exports to slaughter will happen. Now we're outside the EU and have the freedom to do that. Yeah. And those who were successful in the ballot for private members' bills will not be short of other suggestions, both from DEFRA and animal welfare organisations, to carry forward some important measures in that area, which I know is important to the government. The bill to tackle unlicensed and uninsured pedicabs, which can rip off unsuspecting tourists, is not before time. Now, today's focus is on the legislative agenda, but we can't ignore what is going on outside our borders. The butchery we saw from Hamas on October the 7th was evil beyond anything most of us could even imagine. Yeah. And yes, BBC, these thugs are terrorists. Yeah. If those atrocities had been on our soil and our people, then we would also have been expected to launch a robust response. Yeah. Israel has that right too. Indeed, what else did Hamas expect would happen? The conflict in Ukraine may be off the front pages, but we must not waver in our support for the courageous Ukrainian people. Yeah. Good government is not so much about how many laws you have and how many new laws you announce, but how you respond to changing and unexpected events like the pandemic. Yeah. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. But the Prime Minister's furlough scheme and help for businesses were the right thing to do. Yeah. The universal credit system was also robust in the face of unprecedented demand. With small boat crossings of the Channel down by more than a fifth year on year, we are making progress in curbing the organised criminal gangs engaged in this dangerous exploitative trade. Furthermore, if we can stand up the Rwanda scheme, it will be a game changer. Our help should be for those most in need, not those most able to pay. Finally, an absolute true story from the 2019 winter general election, and I heard your strictures about being truthful to the House. This has absolutely happened. One of the strongest Labour areas in my patch is a former council estate called Eastfield. We usually go there early in the campaign to get it out of the way. This time, it was different. People were actually crossing the street to shake my hand. They had voted for Brexit and wanted to get it done and were sick of being ignored. My wife Maureen knocked on one door. The lady who answered was effusive in her admiration for Prime Minister Johnson. Arriving myself, I asked her why she was so enthusiastic. She said, "Boris is one of us." When I politely pointed out he'd been to Eton and Oxford, she replied, "You don't understand. He had a row with his wife and the police came round." That's what happens on this street all the time. I commend the gracious speech to the House.
Siobhan Bailey.
Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to second the loyal address, and I'm proud that the Stroud constituency is playing its part in history, given that this is the first state opening of His Majesty the King. The late Queen was an inspiration for everyone across this great nation and for members of this House. She reminded us that despite the melodrama of politics, we are all here to serve the public. The King is already following in his mother's footsteps and making us all proud. Although when I told my non-political family that I was going to be talking about the King's speech, the response I got back was, "Oh, great, that's a really good film." Talking about hard acts to follow, the Right Honourable Member for Scarborough and Whitby had been doing a fair few lols then. I know exactly the areas that he's talking about, and I think he's definitely landed that promotion with that speech in his final furlong. So we've got many connections which I'll touch on today, but his Scarborough FC is actually playing Stroud's Forest Green Rovers in the FA Cup next week. So we've got another rumble to come as well. So, listen, I know the Right Honourable Member will be missed when he gets his pipe and slippers out to retire next year, but his lovely new grandchildren are going to be keeping him very busy. So I actually went to school in the Right Honourable Member's constituency, and if I could tell a younger me in Scarborough wearing Spice Girl platforms, Adidas tracky bottoms and a second-hand Umbro jumper, it was a very strong look, and I am very grateful that camera phones were not allowed. But if I could tell that young fashionista that I would have the privilege of representing the most beautiful constituency of Stroud, speaking ahead of the Prime Minister after being in the same room as the King and the Queen, I think the young me would have thought I'd have lost the plot. So what did the Conservative Party do for a free school meal kid who left home at 15 and did not go to uni? They gave her the seat at the most famous palace in the world, led by the son of a pharmacist, who is also leading the most diverse cabinet that we have ever known. And so the public service bit of this job motivates me, but it's not what hits the headlines. I am often asked, how do you survive with everybody backstabbing, doing their own thing and out to get each other? And I just smile and say, I don't hang around with the Labour Party. We're all in it together. I love you all really. And to be honest, the PLP has absolutely nothing on the Stroud Labour Party who've all resigned and fallen out with each other. But no, what I actually say is that to survive in this place, you have to find some friends and then fully expect them to push you in the Thames in the run-up to a reshuffle. You also get new friends for very short periods of time come select committee elections. And I sort of miss the daily messages from the Right Honourable Member for Birmingham Hodge Lodge Hill. His text messages are less famous than his scary handwritten notes about the economy, but they are still persistent. Okay, right, back to navigating a workplace that is mad as a box of frogs. Early on, I came up with Operation Green Benches, whereby I shunned history books and Hansard, and I researched parliamentary sketches instead, because I love them. Quentin Letts once wrote that up here, where I am now, is the naughty corner. So that sorted out where I was going to sit, and it sounded fun, and he was right. I then realised that identifying the loudest colleagues to sit with and effectively hide behind could be absolutely crucial to avoiding the wrath of the Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Elmet and Rothwell seemed to fit this bill. He was described as being expansively waistcoated and having lungs like bagpipes, which is perfect. And he's not in his place, he's watching at home in the telly box, but no doubt is wearing a waistcoat. The Honourable Member for North Dorset and the Right Honourable Member for South Swindon are often depicted as noisy and boisterous, and those two appear to come free with bagpipe lungs in a creative bog-off-style deal that probably should be banned. But, Mr. Speaker, this strategy has served me well, and it's given me a slightly dysfunctional but always hilarious and caring chamber family who I love dearly. The other 5 Gloucestershire MPs are also guiding lights, not least the Right Honourable Member for the Forest of Dean, who taught me that consistent rebelling does not hinder one's career. Chief Whip, I'm not going to follow that way. Now, my kids also come to work with me, so they support her in their own chaotic way. Gigi, age 3, dressed as a witch on Halloween recently, she merrily skipped up some steps of one house and turned to me and said loudly, "Mummy, this is just like canvassing." And then the door opened and she went, "Trick or treat." And I said, well, I blame those CCHQ canvassing screws. It was an absolute disaster. And there's a myriad of female colleagues that naturally support each other, and that's on both sides of the House. And I especially congratulate the Honourable Member for Brecon and Radnorshire on her wedding. She looked absolutely radiant, and I wish her husband and her a long and happy life together. Mr. Speaker, I'm chuffed to be the first MP from Stroud to be asked to second the King's Speech. Stroud, the Valleys and Vale is gorgeous. Please visit. We have the quirky bit of the Cotswolds with a creative, innovative and industrial spirit throughout. People rightly expect a lot of their public servants in our neck of the woods, and I mainly sit in the House of Commons library, as others know, dealing with endless amounts of casework and correspondence. I'm having some successes. I'm steadily chipping away at 20-year-old problems like Tricorn House, accessibility at Stroud Station, and newer challenges like Rush Skate Park and Stroud Maternity's postnatal beds. But people take the mick out of me sitting in the library, but I really like it. It is also never dull. The Honourable Member for Totnes, another Denzian of the library, excitedly texted me one day and said, "Come see my tortoise." Now, I've heard about these public school boys and how they like to give nicknames to things. So it was not without fear and trepidation that I came into his bit of the library to see his tortoise. But happily, Mr. Speaker, it was actually your tortoise that I got to see. He was eating merrily on the terrace. And may I say that your decision to add giant cats and other creatures to this already odd place is very welcome. I listened carefully to what His Majesty the King had to say earlier. It is customary to be jolly in seconding a speech, but we all know that these are difficult times. To hear that the government's focus is on security challenges, both domestic and international, was extremely important. Thereafter, I can get behind all actions to increase economic growth and help our constituents with day-to-day pressures or injustices. By way of an example, Stroud constituents should not be ripped off by rogue property property management companies. I commend the campaigning of local people and the honourable members North East Bedfordshire and Westminster to get leasehold reform and protections for homeowners on the agenda. The King's comments about putting people in control of their futures and a focus on town regeneration give me hope for High Street's businesses in fantastic areas like Berkeley and Stroud Town. And with the PM gripping AI and new technology, we're poised and ready to fly with innovation on renewables, hydrogen ice, and in nuclear and many other STEM fields. The government's long-term NHS workforce programmes has to get lift off if we're to help Stroud maternity midwives. I've long campaigned for more apprentices as well, so let's get rid of all barriers in further education. My excellent friend and constituency neighbour, the Right Honourable Member for Cheltenham, is clearly going to have a lot to do in justice, but I still hope that he will look closely at family law reform to keep cases involving children out of the court system. And while I was not expecting new childcare announcements, I urge all of the government to get behind the Chancellor's investment in families by urgently boosting the early years workforce. Now, His Majesty the King said the government will lead on action to tackle biodiversity loss. Prime Minister, with COP28 approaching, this means that you should get familiar with WWT Slimbridge's flamingos in my patch. I will take all the help I can get to get a dedicated domestic wetlands team and wetland strategy in DEFRA. And if not persuaded, flamingos are absolutely marvellous for that wonderful Instagram account that you have. The King is also WWT's president, and wetlands can genuinely help reach our net zero targets. So I said earlier that public service was a privilege, and I genuinely meant that. It gives us the chance to change things for everyday families and champion those who deserve or need our support. It also allows the hardest working Prime Minister I have known, and I've known quite a few recently. At one point, my baby was 3 months old. I think she'd met three Prime Ministers at the same time. But he shows the country week in and week out how we can bring long-term change against global headwinds. And I second this loyal address to the House.
The question is that the humble address be presented to His Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I turn to the address, I'm sure the whole House would like to join me in paying tribute to His Majesty the King on the occasion of his first gracious address as our Sovereign. Of course, he did give the address last year, and he has, for some time, enjoyed the best view in the House on how it should be done. But nonetheless, this is a new chapter for him and our country, so we pay tribute to him on that. Let me also congratulate both the mover and the seconder for their fantastic speeches just a moment ago. The Right Honourable Member for Scarborough and Whitby once again showed us his deep love for his constituency and delivered a truly great speech. He has been a good servant and well respected across this House. But he is now wanted again on his farm. And I can inform the House that he's also one of the country's leading steam engine enthusiasts. The proud owner of a Fowler K5 ploughing engine. Not a tractor, but nonetheless, a beautiful machine, which on a good day, when the Right Honourable Member really steps on it, can still give the Trans-Pennine Express a run for its money. But I warn him, he should be careful. There are some weird and wonderful details on all those Network North announcements. And the Prime Minister might commandeer his Fowler for illustrative purposes only. Of course. It was also great to hear the honourable member for Stroud again give a really powerful and great speech to this House. It's only right that the Prime Minister selected someone with good sense to second the gracious address. And so, of course, he had to turn to a working-class lawyer with a connection to Camden. And I can say from personal knowledge and from many people in Camden that as a Camden councillor, she was respected across parties, as she is here. Now, a year ago, the honourable member rightly pointed out, and I quote, that there are many ways to boost domestic energy security using nuclear, solar, marine energy and onshore wind. An argument, Mr. Speaker, which shows exactly why she has a bright future within her party. It's a shame that instead of choosing her to second the address, the Prime Minister didn't ask her to write the energy section instead. Mr. Speaker, we are lucky enough not to have lost any members of this House since the last address. But as we approach the end of this cycle, it is only right that we once again remember those who we all still miss so much and who left us earlier in this Parliament. On these benches, our beloved friend, Jack Dromey, a champion of working people for the ages. And on the benches opposite, Dame Cheryl Gillan, James Brokenshire, and, of course, Sir David Amess, who was taken from us in the most vile and cruel of circumstances. On these benches, we still mourn the loss of Joe Cox, one of our brightest lights, 7 years ago now, in similar fashion. So we reach out across the aisle and say, as does the plaque put up just over there in the recent weeks, his light remains. Mr. Speaker, it's also customary to welcome new members to this House. Though I have to say, given you're a stickler for parliamentary time limits, this could be difficult. But I do welcome all 11 new members to the first of these debates. 1 for the party opposite, 2 for the party that sits over there, and 8 on these benches. Victories which show without question that Britain is ready for change. Victories that have reduced the party opposite, now nearly 14 years in power, to the desperate spectacle of claiming it offers change away from itself. Today's address shows just how ridiculous that posturing is, because what we have before us is a plan for more of the same, more sticking plasters, more division, more party-first, country-second gimmicks, and no repudiation of the utterly discredited idea that economic growth is something the few hand down to the many. In fact, today we reach something of a new low, because they're not even pretending to govern anymore. They've given up on any sense of service. They see our country's problems as something to be exploited, not solved. And in doing this, they underestimate the British people. Because what Britain wants is for them to stop messing around and get on with the job. People want action, not inaction. Solution to real problems, not the imaginary ones that haunt their party's imagination. A government committed to the national interest, not desperately trying to save their own skin. Our schools are crumbling, waiting lists rising, rivers and streams dying, infrastructure cancelled, violent criminals released early, their mortgage bombshell blowing up the finances of millions, growth set to be the lowest in the G7 next year, taxes higher than at any time since the war. He raised them himself 25 times. The Tory recipe for British decline: low growth, high tax, crumbling public services, with the Prime Minister serving up more of the same. Now, of course, there are steps we can welcome: Jade's Law, Martin's Law, an independent regulator in football. And we have said on smoking and public health, he can count on our votes. We will always serve the national interest. And that is why this House has stood united in our support for Ukraine since the start of Putin's aggression. And we must never lose our resolve or focus. The address also mentions the terrible events in Israel and Palestine. It is now 1 month exactly since the senseless murder of Jews by the terrorists of Hamas and the taking of hostages on October the 7th. And every new day in Gaza now brings with it more pain, more suffering, more agony. Hostages still held, thousands of civilians dead, including so many innocent women and children, millions struggling for the basics of life: food, water, sanitation, medicines and fuel. We cannot and we will not close our eyes to their suffering. We need a humanitarian pause now. The hostages to be released now. Israel has the right and duty to defend herself, but it is not a blank cheque. It must comply with international law. And this House must commit to do whatever it can to keep alive the light of peace. So we welcome the address's clear commitment to support the two-state solution. But, Mr. Speaker, returning once more to their plans for Britain, the biggest question is how they think this is anywhere near good enough. After all the chaos they've unleashed, after levelling up, no rules were broken, we're all in it together, and all the other broken promises of the last 13 years, this is the plan they put to the working people of this country and say, trust us, we've changed. It's laughable. They can't see Britain. That's the only possible conclusion. The walls of this place are too high. But let me assure the House, Britain sees them, and Britain sees today that they offer no change on public services, no change on the cost of living crisis, and no change to the economic model that has failed to give working people the security and opportunity that they deserve. Because, Mr. Speaker, that is the change that Britain needs. And today was a missed opportunity. We needed a King's speech that would draw a line under 13 years of Tory decline, a King's speech for national renewal and a serious plan for growth. But instead, we have a party so devoid of leadership, it is happy to follow a Home Secretary who describes homelessness as a lifestyle choice. And believes that the job of protecting us all from extremists, the most basic job of government, is legitimate terrain for her divisive brand of politics. Mr. Speaker, as Director of Public Prosecutions, I worked closely with the police and counter-terrorism forces. Their job is hard enough already without the Home Secretary using it as a platform for her own ambitions. So I say to the Prime Minister, think very carefully about what she is committing your government to do. And think very carefully about the consequences of putting greater demands on public servants at the coalface of keeping us safe. Because without a serious Home Secretary, there can be no serious government, and he cannot be a serious Prime Minister. Homelessness is a choice. It's a political choice. Constant U-turns on no-fault evictions are political choices. Not facing up to the blockers of aspiration on those benches is a political choice. And it's not that there aren't better choices. On these benches, we have a plan to build 1.5 million homes across the country with a reformed planning regime that will unlock our potential. Because you can't fix homelessness without increasing the supply of housing. You can't boost growth and let workers have homes they need. And you can't escape the cost of living crisis unless there's more affordable housing. Now, we all know why he finds himself in this position. But if he's prepared to stand up to the blockers, if he shows he can radically improve the supply of housing by bringing back national housing targets, then yes, he can count on Labour votes. Because, Mr. Speaker, that is what this country needs most, a credible plan for growth. A Britain where growth comes from the grassroots, where growth serves the grassroots, with higher living standards in every community. An ambition that can only be delivered if we roll up our sleeves and get building. At the moment, just to get a tunnel built in this country can require a planning application 30 times longer than the complete works of Shakespeare. That is why today we needed a planning bill to strip out the red tape and get Britain building. We also needed a bold commitment to train the next generation with new technical colleges, apprenticeship levy reform, expert teachers in every classroom, giving British businesses the skills they need. We needed a modern industrial strategy on a statutory footing with a bill to match, a signal of intent to the world that we are serious about fighting for the jobs of the future. We needed an employment bill. Time and again, this bill has been promised. Time and again, it fails to materialise. When we could be scrapping fire and rehire, ending zero-hour contracts, making work pay with a real living wage, and saying unambiguously that strong workers' rights are good for growth. What we got instead is an exercise in economic miserablism, an admission that his government has no faith in Britain's ability to avert decline. Take the oil and gas bill announced today, a bill that everyone in the energy sector knows is a political gimmick. Yeah. And even the Energy Secretary admits will not take a single penny off anyone's bills. Now, I don't know which of his 7 bins the Prime Minister chucked her meat tax in, but this one will follow soon. Nonetheless, it is a gimmick that tells a story. A King's speech with no concern for the national interest, wallowing in a pessimism that says the hard road to a better future isn't for Britain. It's been this way for 13 years now, a failure to seize the opportunities, perhaps even to see the opportunities. Working people hit because they didn't build the gas storage, they didn't invest in clean British energy, they scrapped home insulation, and they're doing it all again, moving the targets back, passing it on to the next generation, even as costs rise and rise. Sticking plaster politics, an approach as riven through the foundations of our security as the crumbling concrete in our schools. The never-ending cycle of Tory Britain, party first, country second, drift, stagnate, decline. We have to turn the page on this, Mr. Speaker. They are wrong about clean energy. It is cheaper, it is British, and it can give us real security from tyrants like Putin. But more importantly, they are wrong about Britain. We can win the race for the jobs of tomorrow. We can work hand in glove with the private sector and invest in the critical infrastructure, the gigafactories, the new ports, the clean British steel that can once again light the fire of renewal in Britain's industrial communities. Today was the day we could have struck the match on that light, embraced a new sense of mission and tackled the cost of living crisis with a new plan for growth. It was a chance to get Britain building again, take back our streets, get the NHS back on its feet, deliver cheaper bills with real energy security and tear down the barriers to opportunity. But, Mr. Speaker, for the 14th year in a row, the government passed it up, severed its relationship with Britain's future and gave up on the national interest. Because what this address shows with ever greater clarity is that the only fight left in them is the fight for their own skin. A government that has given up, dragging Britain down with them ever more steadily towards decline. A day when it became crystal clear that the change Britain needs is from Tory decline to Labour renewal.
Let us call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first King's speech in 70 years and the first of His Majesty's reign, a reign that is already defined by the same wisdom, grace and compassion that marked a long record of service. So can I take this opportunity on behalf of the whole House to express our admiration and gratitude to His Majesty the King. Mr. Speaker, before we get into the traditional debate, let me first address the situation in Israel and Gaza. All of us in this House care deeply about the suffering of innocent people and the scenes we have witnessed. And we abhor the way that Hamas use innocent Palestinians as human shields. It is right that the United Kingdom is doubling our aid funding for Palestinian civilians. And we have been consistent throughout in our calls for a humanitarian pause as soon as possible to get aid in and hostages and foreign nationals out. But a unilateral and unconditional ceasefire would simply allow Hamas to entrench its position and continue its attacks against Israel. Only last week, Hamas reiterated its intentions, stating clearly, "We will repeat the October 7th attack time and again until Israel is annihilated." Faced with such a threat, no country could be reasonably expected not to act. Last week, I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu to reiterate the United Kingdom's backing for Israel's right to defend itself. It is the first duty of any government. I also stressed the need to allow more aid into Gaza, to take all possible measures to minimize civilian casualties, and to avoid inflaming tensions in the West Bank, where settler violence must stop. I can update the House that now well over 100 British nationals have been able to leave Gaza, thanks to our diplomatic efforts to reopen the Rafah crossing. And the Development Minister will make a full statement to the House tomorrow. But let me also reiterate this. We will not stand for the hatred and anti-Semitism we have seen on our streets. It sickens me to think that British Jews are looking over their shoulder in this country. That children are going to school covering up their school badges for fear of attack. This government will do whatever it takes to keep the Jewish community safe. Just as we will do whatever it takes to keep every community safe. And we will fight hatred and extremism in all its forms and wherever it is found, today, tomorrow, and always. We are the world's most successful, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy, and we will protect our democracy from all threats to it. Mr. Speaker, this King's speech is about what this government is about, taking long-term decisions to build a brighter future for our country. It builds on foundations that were far stronger than they were just a year ago. Inflation falling and on track to be halved. An economy now growing faster than France and Germany. National debt on track to fall. More support for the NHS this winter, and we are stopping the boats with crossings this year down by over a fifth, as we ensure that it is this government and not criminal gangs who decides to come to our country. Now that we strengthen the foundations, this King's speech turns to the future, taking long-term decisions with a single objective: to change our country for the better. Change in our economy, with new legislation to improve our energy security. Join a huge trade pact with the fastest growing region in the world and prepare to seize the opportunities of a new technological age. Change in our society with new protections for leaseholders and renters, a bill to safeguard the future of football clubs and fans, and the historic legislation that will finally create the first smoke-free generation, and change to keep our nation secure and our communities safe, with tougher sentences for criminals, more powers for the police and security services, and tough new action to clamp down on antisocial behaviour. What will all this mean for the British people, Mr. Speaker? More jobs, more investment and higher growth. More police on the streets with stronger powers to keep us safe. Places people are proud to call home. A country strong at home, confident abroad, and with a better future ahead for all our people. That is the change that this King's speech and this government will deliver. Mr. Speaker, His Majesty's gracious speech was brilliantly proposed by my right honourable friend, the member for Scarborough and Whitby. Now, I will always be grateful to him, because when I was first selected as the Conservative candidate for Richmond, my right honourable friend took a call from a prominent farmer in my local community who had expressed some consternation about the revelation that I didn't eat beef. Quick as a flash, my right honourable friend replied, "Don't worry, he's the perfect candidate. There'll be more for me and thee." And as a proud Yorkshireman, my right honourable friend has a reputation for being very careful with money. Just the other day, he went shopping for a new pair of shoes. When the shop assistant tried to throw away the old pair, he said, "Hang on a second, I want to keep those laces. There's still life in them yet." And I've often regarded myself as a trainee Yorkshireman, and it turned out with him I was also a trainee fiscal conservative. And that's why I asked my right honourable friend to apply his same zeal for savings to efficiencies that we could make across Whitehall. He came back with a great list. Yorkshire tea bags are perfectly fine for another 3 or 4 goes. The DEFRA thermostat was set far too high at 17 degrees. And 7 bins are simply far too many. My right honourable friend is probably the only member of this House who is the proud owner of his own graveyard. Apparently, he even does some of the digging himself. And no wonder he's such a staunch supporter of the government's plan to protect renters, because he fully supports the right of his tenants to be left undisturbed over the very long term. Now, in his maiden speech, my right honourable friend proudly boasted that Whitby and his constituency was voted #1 weekend holiday destination by the readers of Saga magazine. Well, I am delighted as my honourable friend retires and lifts his gaze from his own copy of Saga that he already finds himself in the home of blue skies, blue waters and blue rinses. Whitby is, as he reminded us, where Dracula made landfall. That shadowy, pale, haunting figure, aged beyond his years. And that's what 2 decades in this House can do for you, Mr. Speaker. But as a government whip, a minister in 4 departments and a dedicated constituency MP, my right honourable friend has had an extraordinary career. Among his many achievements, I would particularly highlight his introduction of the first ever roadside drug tests. Before that, we had no way of clamping down on dangerous drug driving. This was a landmark policy that has saved untold numbers of lives. It is a legacy he should be proud of, and a reminder of the good that politics can do. My right honourable friend is a great parliamentarian. I'm proud to call him a friend. His speech was in the finest traditions of this House, and his wit, integrity and sound good sense will be much missed on all sides. Now, Mr. Speaker, continuing the North Yorkshire theme, the gracious speech was brilliantly seconded by someone also born and bred in God's own county, who is today the honourable member for Stroud. And I'm sure the whole House will join me in paying tribute to our fantastic NHS and sending our very best wishes to her daughter Tilly. Now, some may think of my honourable friend as a shy, retiring and studious type. After all, as she said today, she often prefers to be in the library. But we are discovering another side to my honourable friend. We've now heard about her time in the naughty corner. We've heard about the Spice Girl platforms. And I can also today reveal that back in the 1990s, she won the prestigious, fiercely contested crown of Yorkshire rock and roll dancing queen. And in a rich and varied career, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend was also a highly regarded yoga teacher. So when she read in the Times that the shadow cabinet were being encouraged to take up yoga in the office, she was waiting for the phone call. But it turns out that no Conservative, not even one as supremely talented as my honourable friend, can teach the party opposite anything when it comes to constantly changing from one contorted position to another. My honourable friend also mentioned today taking advice and inspiration from a certain parliamentary sketchwriter. Well, if she's hoping that one day he might make her the target of his acerbic wit, well, Mr. Speaker, I would just say, be careful what you wish for. I have been called many things in my time, but I'm not sure I will ever forget being branded the titch in vacuum-packed underpants. But on a serious note, my honourable friend has already made a huge impact on her short time in this place. Nowhere more than in her fantastic campaign to improve childcare provision. Inspiring my honourable friend, the Chancellor, to announce 30 hours of free childcare a week for under fours in England in the March budget. This is a landmark policy that will make an enormous difference to millions of families up and down the country, and my honourable friend should be incredibly proud of her part in making that happen. She overcame great odds to reach her place today. Growing up on free school meals, she left home as a teenager and worked her way up as a family lawyer without attending university before becoming the first female MP of Stroud in 2019. Sometimes people ask me what being a Conservative is all about. I can think of no greater example than that, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is a remarkable person, a dedicated MP, someone with a huge future ahead, and her speech was in the finest traditions of this House. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me also thank the Leader of the Opposition for his contribution to this debate, and indeed his first U-turn of it. As a former Republican, he used to think this country shouldn't even have a King's Speech. But at least that is one U-turn the whole country will welcome. Now, the right honourable gentleman is prone to changing his position, but in fairness, his speech did strike a few consistent notes. Higher inflation, more strikes, more immigration, and higher borrowing. The party opposite's plan to unnecessarily borrow £28 billion more every year and give in to inflation-busting pay demands from their union paymasters is dangerous, inflationary, and the British people would pay the price in higher interest rates and higher taxes. Now, in truth, Mr. Speaker, Labour will borrow anything, people's money, people's ideas, and it now turns out that his copy-and-paste Chancellor is very happy to borrow other people's work too. But she's not the only member opposite to get unstuck by a book. Earlier this year, the Leader of the Opposition had to abandon writing his own book, Return the Deposit. It was supposed to be his vision for Britain, but his publishers discovered what the British people already know: he simply doesn't have one. While he stands for the same old ideas, we are focused on the long-term decisions that will provide a better and brighter future for everyone, and that's what this King's Speech will deliver, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that change starts with changing our economy. We've already delivered the largest fall in inflation since the 1980s, a faster recovery from the pandemic than Germany, France and Japan, and tens of billions of pounds of new investment from around the world. We believe the role of government is to create the conditions for the private sector to thrive. That's where new growth and new jobs come from. That's why we've given business a £27 billion tax cut on investment, launched 12 free ports around the UK to create jobs and investment, and introduced legislation in this King's Speech so that we can confirm our membership of the CPTPP, a huge trading pact with the fastest growing region in the world. Now, of course, I hear from the party opposite that it make no difference. We can only do that because of our new freedoms outside of the European Union. Freedoms that the Leader of the Opposition wants to abandon and instead lock the United Kingdom into a new European deal that would tie us into EU rules and regulations that we'd have no say over and open our borders to 100,000 additional EU migrants every single year. Now, as well as failing to secure our borders, the opposition would also fail to secure our energy supplies. Now, we know that economic growth requires energy security. We've already invested record amounts in renewables like offshore wind. We back Sizewell C, the first new nuclear in decades. And the King's Speech introduces new legislation for North Sea oil and gas, supporting hundreds of thousands of British jobs. And compare and contrast with the opposition's energy policy. Compare and contrast.
People have the right to intervene. No, if the Prime Minister wishes to give way, that's up to the Prime Minister. If he wishes not to, that's also fine.
Will the Prime Minister allow?
Prime Minister.
Compare and contrast.
The Prime Minister's not giving way. Prime Minister.
Compare and contrast with the opposition's energy policy. There's one word for it: naive. Not my word, Mr. Speaker, but that of their own union paymasters. I'll happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister, bearing in mind that a very significant proportion of people who sleep rough are army veterans and people who've had acquired brain injuries. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Home Secretary when she says that homelessness, sleeping rough, is a lifestyle choice? And if he doesn't, will he sack her?
Mr. Speaker, I don't draw the link from that to energy security, but what I can tell him is that thanks to the efforts of the member for Plymouth Vorview, veterans' homelessness is at record low levels in this country. And in fact, rough sleeping overall is down by around a third since the peak, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the actions of this government, and in particular, the landmark Homelessness Reduction Act passed by this government, which has helped relieve or prevent over 640,000 people's homelessness, Mr. Speaker. But returning to energy security, the party opposite want to ban all new oil and gas licences, risking us becoming even more dependent on Putin's Russia for our crucial supplies of energy. But what's even more absurd about their policy, Mr. Speaker, is this. The honourable gentleman isn't against oil and gas, all oil and gas. He's just against British oil and gas. And yes, Mr. Speaker, unlike the opposition, who want to pursue net zero with an ideological zeal, going even faster and further no matter what the cost or the disruption, we on this side of the House are cutting the cost of net zero for working people, saving British families £5, £10, £15,000, and that's the choice, Mr. Speaker. I'll happily give way to Honourable.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and I want to ask him when he's going to start being straight with the British public, because, he pretends that new oil and gas licences will somehow guarantee our energy security when he knows that oil and gas is sold on international markets to the highest bidder. He pretends it's going to get people's bills down, yet his own Secretary of State for Energy has said that it will not get people's bills down. So when is he going to stop governing by gimmick? And when is he going to start actually rolling out the home insulation programme that will get people's bills down?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talked about being straight. It's this party and me that was straight with the British people about the costs of getting to net zero, something that her and the party opposite would do well to follow. And because we've been honest and transparent and we have cut those costs, we will save British families £5, £10 or £15,000.
Prime Minister, just a second. He gave way to you. At least give the courtesy of hearing the answer. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, and that's the simple choice. A government on the side of hard-working people, or an opposition and the Honourable Lady on the side of the eco-zealots, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, if we want to truly change our country, we need a stronger society. And that's why this King's Speech introduces a landmark bill to create the first smoke-free generation. It will prevent deaths, improve people's lives, and free the NHS to support others. It is the most significant public health intervention by any government for generations. Historic change from a historic King's Speech. But that's not all we're doing for the NHS, Mr. Speaker. The government has invested record sums, created 50 million more primary care appointments, brought more beds, more ambulances, and through the NHS's first ever long-term workforce plan, we will recruit more doctors, nurses and dentists than ever before. That's what the NHS needs, not the damaging strike action that Labour refuses to condemn, even though it is adding tens of thousands of people to waiting lists every single day. The party opposite also opposed our plans to provide a minimum safety level during the strikes. Now, does the party opposite and the honourable member opposite think that vulnerable patients don't deserve life-serving health care, or are they just too weak to stand up to the unions? Either way, the conclusion is clear. You simply can't trust Labour with the NHS, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the most important part of a stronger society, education. Of all that we've achieved since 2010, this is what I am most proud of. Under the party opposite, only 2/3 of schools were rated good or outstanding. Now it is around 90%. They took us down the international league tables. We are now soaring up them. They devalued apprenticeships. We're investing in them. They backed rip-off degrees, and we are ending them. And we're introducing the new Advanced British Standard, so that everyone will study maths and English to 18, learn a broader range of subjects with more hours in the classroom, and finally, break down the barriers between academic and technical education. More teachers, higher standards, and more apprenticeships. On this side of the House, a stronger society is an opportunity society, and this Conservative government is delivering. But we can only build that stronger society with stronger communities. And that's what this King's Speech does. We're reforming the housing market to empower leaseholders, to give renters more security, establishing a new independent football regulator to give fans a greater voice in their clubs, and delivering our promise to level up with record investment in local areas. We're building 1 million more homes, all while protecting the Greenbelt, unlike the Charter for Sprawl that we see from the party opposite. And, Mr. Speaker, that brings me to transport. Every single penny that would have been spent on HS2, a repeatedly delayed, expensive project that failed to meet people's real needs, is now being invested in the North, in the Midlands, and right across the country. £36 billion of investment in projects that people really need and actually want. Network North is, without question, the most ambitious scheme for northern transport any government has developed ever. Yet first, the Leader of the Opposition was against it. Then he was for it. Now he's not really sure. But one thing is for sure, you simply can't trust a word he says. Now, Mr. Speaker, none of those important changes will mean anything if people don't feel safe in their communities. And the facts are clear. It is this government that is on the side of law and order. This King's Speech introduces legislation to better support victims, as well as new measures to combat the scourge of antisocial behaviour, all building on a proud record of tackling crime. 20,000 more police officers on the streets, more police on the streets than ever before. And we've heard a lot about 13 years. Well, since 2010, crime halved. Violent crime halved. Burglary also halved. And antisocial behaviour down by 70%. Tougher sentences for rapists and sex offenders, something that the party opposite voted against, Mr. Speaker. And for the worst offenders, life finally means life. All while the Leader of the Opposition in the front bench campaigned to stop the deportation of dangerous foreign criminals. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're just days away from Remembrance Sunday, so let me close by paying tribute to our armed forces. At this moment, over 7,000 servicemen and women are deployed overseas, from the frozen wastes of the high north to the streets of Kosovo. They are the best of us. We owe to all our veterans a lifelong debt of gratitude. Now, I'm proud of our work led in Cabinet by my right honourable friend, the member for Plymouth Moorview, to make this the best country in the world to be a veteran. And that's what you get with this government. We're on the side of Britain's armed forces. We're investing record amounts in defence. We're an unwavering ally to the Ukrainian people, and we're proud to be one of the largest contributors to NATO. But in contrast, Mr. Speaker, what do you get with the party opposite? They tried to install... They never like being reminded about it, but they tried to install, as Prime Minister, a man who wanted to abolish the armed forces, withdraw from NATO and back the UK's enemies over its allies. Labour can't be trusted with our nation's security, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, this King's speech builds on the strong foundation of economy well on its way to recovery. It rejects big government and instead backs people and businesses to thrive. It strengthens society with historic measures to support the nation's health and education. It secures our streets and borders with tougher sentences for criminals and powers for police. And above all, this King's speech delivers change. Change in our economy, change in our society, change in our communities. It takes long-term decisions for a brighter future, and I commend it to this House.
SNP.
Here, here. Do you want me to wait, Matt?
Right, please leave quietly. Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was it something I said? Like snow off a dike. I wish to begin, as is customary, Mr. Speaker, by passing on my thanks to King Charles and the Queen for their most gracious speech today. I'm sure it was a very momentous occasion for them both. I've been goaded a wee bit about my flower, Mr. Speaker, but notwithstanding that, I intend to start by offering some consensus across the chamber, because I believe that is incredibly important in these times. Firstly, in relation to Ukraine, because it is, of course, fast approaching the 2-year anniversary of Vladimir Putin's decision to enter Ukraine in an extremely forceful manner, to start a war, to kill civilians and to attack Ukraine's democracy, of course, building upon the footsteps that he had laid in 2014 by invading and annexing Crimea. Now, it's been said in the public domain that the resolve of the West is perhaps shaking in the face of the fact that the conflict continues. But I think we are all united across this chamber, right across parties, about the fact that we are steadfast in our commitment to the Ukrainian people in their fight to protect their democracy against that most abhorrent of tyrants. And, Mr. Speaker, we say that because these are our values. It's what we believe in. We believe in peace, we believe in protecting civilians, and we believe in democracy. And of course, that view that we have extends beyond just Ukraine. It extends to the situation in Israel, in Gaza too. Now, I know I'm at risk of repeating myself here, as indeed many of us do in this chamber from time to time, but I think it is important to reiterate that all of us in this chamber are, of course, united in our unequivocal condemnation of what Hamas did exactly a month ago. There can never be a justification for the senseless killing of men, women and children in the way that that terrorist organisation did. Now, what we've seen on the back of that on our streets is equally, not perhaps as equally, but it is, of course, as concerning, Mr. Speaker, the rise of anti-Semitism, the fear that so many people have been able to walk the streets of these aisles is something which I think we all have grave concerns about. And I want to send my heartfelt support to all of those in the Jewish community, and to make it very clear, if indeed it ever needed to be clear, that we all oppose anti-Semitism. No ifs and no buts. And just finally on that point, Mr. Speaker, I think what we all so urgently want to see is diplomacy in action in order to see the release of the hostages that are still in Hamas's control. There can be, as I have said in relation to other matters, no justification for that, and we all want to see those people returned to their families as quickly as possible. And as I've said previously, I wish the Prime Minister well in that diplomatic pursuit. Mr. Speaker, of course, the conflict in Israel and Gaza cannot be forgotten without, of course, mentioning what we are seeing in Gaza itself. Thousands upon thousands of people have been killed. People don't have access to food, they don't have access to clean water, they don't have access to fuel, they cannot turn on the lights, they don't have access to medicine. In many instances, the hospitals that they go to no longer exist. The schools that they once went to no longer exist. The universities that they once went to no longer exist. What we are seeing, and I think this is perhaps where the agreement across the floor perhaps goes away, what we are seeing is collective punishment. And what we so badly need to see, Mr. Speaker, is a humanitarian ceasefire. No, not a humanitarian pause which fills people's bellies to then be blown up again in the days to follow. What we believe in unequivocally is a humanitarian ceasefire. And I sincerely hope that members across this chamber will join us in coming to that position in the not-too-distant future. Because, Mr. Speaker, those are our values. We believe in peace and we believe in the protection of civilians. Now, Mr. Speaker, to the King's speech itself, I was listening very closely, like others were, and I heard the term economic growth used. And, you know, that intrigued me, because we all know that Britain's broke and Brexit broke it. But we so obviously need economic growth. And for those of us on these benches, there is an obvious solution on this front. There's perhaps 3 or 4 things that we could and should do. Now, they may not be popular with members on certainly the government side and indeed some on the official opposition side, but they are necessary, because all of us, I think, would agree that in order to have economic growth, what you need and what you have to see is the tax base expanded. So the easiest way to do that is to actually increase working age migration into these isles. But beyond that, it's to ensure that the businesses that we all want to see thrive are able to export directly to the biggest markets possible. In our case, there's one sitting just across the channel, the EU single market, Mr. Speaker. And I think we should be a bit more robust and confident about saying that not only do we need more migration on these isles, we need access to that EU single market. And, Mr. Speaker, the argument that the Prime Minister would put forward would be that the agreement, the trade deal that was reached with our friends in Asia is the start of something better. Well, how do we look? And that trade deal is worth 0.08% of GDP. So they would need 50 of those trade deals just to match the 4% hit caused by leaving the European Union. But of course, beyond migration, beyond access to the single market, another way to guarantee economic growth is to enshrine the rights of workers into law through the likes of an employment bill. And, Mr. Speaker, it is a damned disgrace that since 2017 this government has been promising an employment bill and is still not delivered. Mr. Speaker, the fourth strand to achieve economic growth, if colleagues were so willing, would be to double down on investment in net zero, to do as the Americans are doing, to follow the lead of Joe Biden with the Inflation Reduction Act. It makes sense. It makes sense to invest in the technologies of tomorrow so that you don't get left behind, so that you can compete for the decades to come. Net zero is not a hindrance, it's a growth opportunity. Now, I'm pleased that in the speech that we have had today, we've seen an indication that the grid is to be upgraded. That is to be welcomed, long overdue as it is. But what we don't have is any insight as to whether there's going to be a financial mechanism put in place to deliver hydro pump storage in Scotland at Cruachan or Corrie Glass. There's no indication if there's going to be further or new financial mechanisms to support tidal power in Scotland, which is world leading. There's no indication that there's going to be financial mechanisms in place to deliver green hydrogen at scale, not just for people on these isles, but right across the European continent. There was no indication whatsoever that this government is going to fix the failure of the offshore wind auction round, which delivered not a single bid this year. A shameful indictment and damaging, so damaging to Scotland's burgeoning renewables sector. But for folks sitting at home, Mr. Speaker, none of this is tangible, none of this is real. Because people living in Scotland, we're an energy-rich nation, and yet they're living in fuel poverty. We already produce 6 times more gas than we consume, yet people can't afford to turn on their heating. In 2022, we produced enough energy, enough electricity to power all the homes in Scotland for 3.5 years, yet people can't afford to keep the lights on. Now, there was 2 things that the government could have done to support those people. What the government could have done was finally separate the cost of gas from the cost of electricity to protect consumers immediately. And the second thing they could and should have done was to reinstate the £400 energy bill rebate, because we know that people are going to be worse off this year than last. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. Now, they may not be popular in this place, but we will continue to champion them because they are our values. But the challenges people face, Mr. Speaker, extends beyond just their energy bills. It goes to their mortgage bills too. Why is there no action? Why is there no action in relation to mortgage relief? Why is there no action in relation to a price on some staple foods in the supermarkets? Now, it was indicated by a member of the government that's communism. Well, someone should have told Emmanuel Macron, because the French have done it. They've managed to protect their citizens. Why is it good enough for them, but not good enough for us? And ultimately, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the cost of living crisis in its total, when we look at it in its entirety, it exists because of decisions taken in this place. The reason people can't afford to pay their energy bills is because decades of incompetence on energy policy from this place. The reason that people can't afford to pay their mortgage bills is because the Tories crashed the economy. The reason that people can't afford to pay their food bills is because Brexit pushed up the prices delivered by politicians in this place, Mr. Speaker. And we've had enough of it, Mr. Speaker. We've had, of course.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, for the honourable gentleman giving way. He spoke at length about energy and never once mentioned oil. He represents Aberdeen North. I wonder, when the government's bill on oil and gas licences comes to this chamber, will he stand up for his constituents of Aberdeen South and vote with the government, or will he support the SNP position, which is to turn their back on oil and gas workers?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member for Murray is always one for detail, but I represent Aberdeen South, not Aberdeen North. But Mr. Speaker, I think it's just 7 days. It's just 7 days since the government announced 27 licences for offshore oil and gas, and now they've come forward with a proposal to do so on an annual basis. Now, what I would like to see, Mr. Speaker, as I hear the honourable gentleman chuntering for a sedentary position, like a wee daffy. Mr. Speaker, if he was to choose to listen, I will get to my point. What he knows, I believe, is that there has to be an evidence-based approach to oil and gas extraction. An evidence-based approach which is anathema to this government. What we need to be considering is our energy security. What we need to be considering is our commitment to net zero. What we need to be considering is jobs and opportunities. And of course, what we need to be considering is that investment in renewables going forward. Now, what I would like to see the government do, and I'm sure the honourable member would agree with me in this regard, is obviously to ensure that the pre-existing licences for the likes of offshore wind, where the government has failed, we see improvements to ensure that that actually happens, Mr. Speaker. Now, the people of Scotland, when they're looking at this and they see the cost of living challenges and they know that it emanates from the decisions taken in this place, their minds are very much refocused on the fact that where power is devolved, Mr. Speaker, power is retained. And what we need to see, what we so badly need to see, is the powers over our economy, the powers over energy policy, the powers over employment law transferred from this place to Holyrood. And here's why, Mr. Speaker, because when we look at the record of Holyrood in comparison to this place, the difference could not be starker. If you're a young person in Scotland, you'll be born into a baby box. If you go to nursery, you'll receive 1,140 hours of care. If you go to primary school, you'll get a free school meal. If you go to secondary school and want to go to higher education, that will be paid for you. If you then enter the workplace in Scotland, if you become a nurse, you'll be paid more than you are here. The majority of Scots pay less tax than those in England. On your council tax, you'll pay less than those living in England. You'll be able to get crisp, clean water included as part of that bill, Mr. Speaker. Of course, if you want to be in a situation... Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is very keen. Would you like to rise to his feet?
Oh, please. I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way again. He's spoken a lot about economic growth. I wonder then, does he agree with several SNP backbenchers that there should be no place in the SNP Scottish Government for the Greens because they are anti-economic growth?
Mr. Speaker, I believe I was talking about nationalised water in Scotland. Now, it's not just nationalised water in Scotland, it's of course the fact that our railways are nationalised as well. If you want to open a business in Scotland, you'll have access to the small business bonus, and as you get older, you will be able to live in comfort knowing that you'll have access to free personal care. All those things have came about because those are our values. They're tangible and they're real, and what the Scottish Parliament has done is deliver them. And what is going to deliver next is that council tax freeze. A council tax freeze which comes in the face of some Labour councillors in Scotland advocating for a 32% rise in council tax, because only the SNP, using the powers that we have, are protecting the Scottish people during the cost of living crisis, in stark contrast to the failing establishment here in front of us, Mr. Speaker. But of course, it's not all bad news, Mr. Speaker, because we do have one glimmer of hope. The fact that this is not just the Prime Minister's first speech, it's the Prime Minister's last King's speech.
File of the House to Peter Boltonbley.
Having heard the parliamentary leader for the SNP, the question in my mind is whether he anticipates a result of the next general election better or worse than 2017. My guess is it will be worse, when his party got 37% of the vote in Scotland. My constituents would like to have the Barnett formula funding for local government for all the kinds of things that he was speaking about. We would welcome having extra money, and perhaps as we get the economy to grow, we will get the extra money and we'll get services which will go on improving. One point that I think the honourable gentleman could have said is he welcomes the leasehold reform for England which Scotland has had for some time. And if he'd spoken about that, I think we'd have had a welcome across the House for saying that we're catching up with ending the unfairness, the uncertainty and the life of misery which too many residential leaseholders have had for too long. I'm glad that the government is now moving forward. I pay tribute to Gavin Barwell, now Lord Barwell, who was the first housing minister to recognise there was a problem. I'm glad now that the Secretary of State for Levelling Up and his colleagues are taking this forward. And if, when the bill comes forward, it gives us three-quarters of what we want, the Prime Minister can rely on colleagues on both sides of the House and in both chambers to make improvements so we get all of what is needed. People ought to be able to have the same kind of protections as freeholders, residential leaseholders and as tenants, and I'm glad that the government is bringing forward improvements there. On the issues which is overhanging our debates, which is the misery and terror both from the attack on Israel and the Israelis and the condition of people in Gaza, I think we need to just keep in our minds that Hamas, until they release hostages, until they can honestly say that they are not going to go in for a repeat of that kind of attack, and they're going to recognise the state of Israel, they are going to be a continuing problem, and we can't just close our eyes and say an instant, lasting ceasefire will solve all the problems. And although many people have criticised the leader of the opposition for what he said, I think that what he has said and the opposition foreign spokesman have said is worth reading. We have to have an end to the violence. There are plenty of times when I can talk about the terrible way that the aggressive settlements have destroyed people's lives in the West Bank and the conditions of people in Gaza in the past. But since the 7th of October, we have to recognise the bigger reality is that people came forward with a pogrom again, and it prompted the remark from one of my constituents saying there are only 16 million Jews around the world. Why do they keep picking on us? In this country, we have to give protection to people who are Muslims against hatred, protection against people who are Jewish against hatred, and we need to try to make sure that we don't go having demonstrations which look as though they're only on one side, not on both. Everyone needs the protection. Returning to the King's speech, I'm grateful for the opportunity to raise the Holocaust Memorial, which the Prime Minister has spoken about. The original proposals for the Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre were that the memorial will be up within 2 years. That's by the end of 2017. Since then, we've got from 2015, when the proposals came forward, to 2023, 8 years on, and no prospect of that memorial possibly being open for the next 5 years. We have since had the memorial galleries developed in the Imperial War Museum, and I make the proposal that those in charge of the project should get together with Baroness Deitch, with me, and with Anita Wolfish-Fischer, who played in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra and survived Bergen-Belsen, and actually have a private, not secret, but private meeting to discuss how it's possible to have a memorial which meets the task, but not taking over so much Victoria Tower Gardens, and separate away the Learning Centre. Having a double-dug basement in the middle of a small park south of the House of Lords is not appropriate. The last thing I would say is to deal with things which aren't in legislation but are still overhanging this House. One is the Privileges Committee report about interference in their consideration of a complaint. I believe that the House has to take up the challenges which are in the report in the Vote Office and make sure that when standards are challenged, those who have to look at them can look at it without interference. And I just say, because I have noticed who's been in the press recently, that of the 12 examples of interference, 4 came from one person who was a former cabinet minister. I think we ought to make sure that people in the future don't go in for that kind of interference with a Privileges Committee investigation. And the other point on standards is I invite the new chair of the Standards Committee to reopen the changes in proposals on all party groups. I think for the country ones, we ought to find a way of having an umbrella where the IPU and the CPA UK branches can provide the admin, so we don't have to have all the kerfuffle of an annual general meeting with 8 people present and sometimes supervised by others. Let them come under those umbrellas. And for some of the other groups, consider why it is that we're restricting people to 6. I've taken part in all party groups in all my time here. One of them was very few MPs were interested to begin with, and that was leasehold reform. Before people realised there were 6 million leaseholders at risk. In fact, for those who are interested, come to a meeting in room 11 at 6 this evening, when we'll be considering what the government's proposals are and what the all-party group proposes to do about it. I asked the Standards Committee to have a review of that. Having said that, I close by saying to the Leader of the Opposition, he's very welcome in Worthing all the time. If he comes to West Worthing, or Worthing West, he can say how his proposals to ignore local objections and let the bulldozers in will affect the Goring Gap. And if he comes to East Worthing, he can explain to hard-working Labour councillors who are offended they can't be put on the shortlist for their selection for a parliamentary candidate.
Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I, like others, start by paying tribute to His Majesty for delivering his first King's speech. It was clearly a historic moment, but I think for our King it must have been quite an emotional moment. He made reference to his late mother, our late amazing Queen, and I think many of us, in listening to him, felt he delivered that speech with grace and aplomb, and we are very grateful to him. Can I also pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Scarborough and Whitby, and the Honourable Member for Stroud for their speeches. I've always rather admired the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Scarborough, for many reasons. His speech today was extremely entertaining. But I've always liked the fact that he, like many of us on these benches, opposed the third runway at Heathrow, and the fact that he was a constructive, if unfashionable conservative, in his views on a constructive relationship with our European partners. But perhaps what makes him more at home with the current government, after all, is his romantic enthusiasm for the steam engine, as we have heard. More noise than substance and going nowhere in the modern world. Mr. Speaker, my mother-in-law, an expert beekeeper, honey producer, and the swarm officer for North Dorset, no less, would join the seconder of today's motion in congratulating Stroud for being the world's first bee guardian town. I'm sure Stroud has a real buzz about it. But the House will be pleased that I don't intend to drone on and on. And, Mr. Speaker, given your strictures at the beginning of this debate, I would like to clarify I was not referring to any other members. I'm talking about droning on. Mr. Speaker, today's humble address is overshadowed by horrifying events around the world. The monstrous terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel 1 month ago. Over 1,400 Israelis slaughtered, hundreds taken hostage. They are in our thoughts today. And now the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Innocent Palestinians cut off from food, water and medicine, their homes destroyed, over 10,000 killed. And war on our continent too, as the brave Ukrainian people continue to resist Vladimir Putin's war machine. At times of global crisis like this, the UK can be a force for good when it stands tall in the world. But, Mr. Speaker, the British voice can only be at its strongest when we have a government that is strong and a government that is united. And I'm afraid that is sadly lacking now. As the humble address shows, we don't even have a government strong and united to take real action here on the challenges people face at home. For these are very, very tough times for the British people. They're working hard, showing remarkable decency and strength. People are finding it harder and harder just to make ends meet. Instead of helping, what has this out-of-touch Conservative government done in this King's speech and over the last few years? They put up taxes. They put up energy bills and mortgage payments too, adding to the pain instead of soothing it. Just look at energy in particular, Mr. Speaker. Today, the government could have brought forward plans to ensure Britain's energy security and bring down energy prices, sustainable energy price cuts for the long term. The government could have announced plans to insulate homes to cut people's energy bills, to invest properly in cheap, clean, renewable energy for the future. Instead, the Conservatives are choosing once again to shackle us to the expensive, dirty fossil fuels of the past. Mr. Speaker, today's address is yet more proof that this is a government that simply doesn't care. Just last week, the COVID inquiry heard that during the pandemic, the government thought older people should just accept their fate. A callous approach that reveals an attitude that stretches far beyond the pandemic. By failing to address the cost of living crisis, the NHS and care crisis, or the sewage crisis and many other crises like them, this King's speech essentially tells families and pensioners struggling to get by to accept their fate. This government is telling the pensioner waiting weeks to see her GP to accept her fate. It tells the cancer patient waiting months just to start treatment to accept his fate. It tells the communities seeing their rivers polluted and their countryside destroyed to accept their fate. It tells the British people fed up with being taken for granted by an out-of-touch government to accept their fate. But, Mr. Speaker, whatever this government might want, the people of our great country, the British people, have never been ones to sit back quietly and accept their fate. They won't accept a government that is so weak and so divided that it cannot tackle the country's challenges. They won't accept a Conservative Party that is out of touch and out of ideas. They will kick it out of office. And they will get that chance soon. Because no matter how long the Prime Minister delays it, an election is coming. So the British people don't have to accept the miserable fate of this tired Conservative government. They can choose a better future, and, Mr. Speaker, I believe they will.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I wish to draw the House's attention to two particular entries in my register of interests. I'm Director and Chair of the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking, and I chair the Aldersgate Group, which brings businesses, NGOs, academics and others together to champion a prosperous, net zero emissions, environmentally sustainable economy. Both of these are unpaid roles. Mr Speaker, I'm also sorry that the Honourable Member for Mid-Bedfordshire is no longer in his seat, because I wanted to take this opportunity, and I'm going to say it anyway, to welcome him to this House, despite the fact that I did work to make sure that he didn't get here in the first place. And the reason I wanted to welcome him and congratulate him is that he is actually my first cousin once removed. I'm not sure, Mr Speaker, whether that connection will do more damage to his career or indeed mine.
We all are black sheep.
But in case you're wondering about the family, I should tell everybody that we share a relative whom I'm told in his youth toyed with communism, and another relative, my cousin, the Honourable Gentleman Member for Mid-Bedfordshire's uncle, who was the former Liberal Democrat leader of Brighton Council. So we cover all bases. Can I also congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Scarborough and Whitby, and my honourable friend, the member for Stroud, on what I thought were witty, incisive, thoughtful and excellent speeches in proposing and seconding the humble address. There are things in the King's speech that I do indeed welcome. I welcome some of them which may not have been spotted by other members of the House. I welcome the fact that it is proposed to amend the Investigatory Powers Act. This was a very important piece of legislation, groundbreaking when it was brought through when I was Home Secretary, but it is right that we look again as things have developed to ensure that we are that we have the legislation that is right to keep us safe. I also welcome the references to taking more action on child sexual abuse, including grooming, which I think is particularly important. And having seen, in my time, the T-levels introduced, and having long thought that we needed to ensure an equivalence between academic and technical or vocational qualifications in this country, I welcome the government's intention of doing just that. Indeed, I welcome the long-term ambition that the government has expressed, its need to take long-term decisions, because good government is not about grabbing at short-term decisions to get a headline. It is about doing what is in the national interest and in the longer-term future interest of this country. But on that point, I was rather surprised recently when I received an email from, in the name of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, sent out, I think, by the Conservative Party, where it said the following: from net zero to HS2, smoking to education, we're going to tackle the challenges that other politicians have been afraid to even talk about. Now, since I read that, I've been racking my brains as to which Prime Minister it was put net zero in 2050 into legislation. Answers on a postcard, please. Can I say that, as I say, I welcome the long-term approach that's being taken by the government, but are some elements that I think should have been in the King's speech, and I'm concerned that they're missing. The first is on modern slavery. Back in 2022, the legislative reform agenda published by the then Prime Minister's office for the late Queen's speech outlined plans to reform the Modern Slavery Act, and in particular to introduce stronger measures in relation to businesses and their supply chains. I believe businesses can be transformative if they really look into their supply chains and take action if they find forced labour and exploitation in those supply chains. So I'm very sorry that we have not seen that amendments to the Modern Slavery Act brought forward in this gracious speech. I'm also concerned about the lack of commitment to a new Mental Health Act. It was back in 2017 that the review into the Mental Health Act was announced. That was completed in 2018. There was a white paper in 2021, a draft bill in 2022, and the Joint Committee finished its consideration, its legislative scrutiny of that draft bill in January of this year. Several months on, we have not seen a government response to that report, and as we now see from 2017 to 2023, 6 years on, we have not seen a commitment to a new Mental Health Act. I believe it is important that we do this. It is something that many voters will want to see being done. I hope that in the... If I may just finish this sentence, and I hope that in the other measures the government will bring forward, they will consider including the Mental Health Act.
I'm extremely grateful to my right honourable friend for making that powerful point about the Mental Health Act. And does she agree with me that another benefit of bringing that legislation forward is to end the archaic elision of conditions like autism and neurodiverse conditions with mental health? This is legislation that is needed now, not next year.
Can I say to my right honourable and learned friend that he has indeed been a champion for those who are on the autistic spectrum, and he has long been raising these issues in relation to autism and neurodiversity. And he's absolutely right, these changes are needed now, not to be delayed further. So as I say, I sincerely hope that in the other measures the government will consider bringing that new Mental Health Act forward. And then the other issue I wanted to raise, and it struck me, I spoke to pupils at Cox Green School in my constituency a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about various issues, and the teacher asked them to raise their hands if they were concerned about mental health, and actually the majority did that, and then to raise their hands if they were concerned about climate change and the environment, and the majority raised their hands there. And I think in relation to the King's Speech and the government's programme on climate change and environmental degradation, the government is missing an opportunity. What we need to do now is press the accelerator on transition to a green economy, not try to draw back. And I fear that despite the fact that the King's Speech says my ministers will seek to attract record levels of investment in renewable energy sources, that is not sufficiently strong an ambition from the government to make sure that they are making that transition quickly enough to ensure that we reach net zero in 2050. It is no good, if the honourable gentleman just rang me, it's no good waking up on the 1st of January 2045 and saying we've got 5 years to do something, let's do it now, because that will be even more costly for members of the public.
Can I thank the honourable lady for maiden intervention in this term? Can I commend the honourable lady, right honourable lady, for what she's saying? In Northern Ireland, the contract for difference scheme, we don't have it, but they have it here in the mainland. I've been keen to pursue this with government. It would help the UK of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland receive and meet their net zero figures that they've set out. Northern Ireland needs to be a part of that, but the contract for difference scheme is a...
No, Mr Shannon, just sit down a slight second. We know it's on zero, but the point is this is a speech, not a question, so quickly come to the end.
Just say, does the right honourable lady agree we in Northern Ireland want to be part of the net zero scheme? Is it not right that we should do that through the contract for difference scheme? Thank you.
There you go. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'm tempted to say to the honourable gentleman that he was called and it was only 4:23. So I think he should... but can I say to him that, of course, we want to make sure that in plans all parts of the United Kingdom are part of that. I don't know the contract for difference details that he's talked about, but we do want to make sure that every part of the United Kingdom is able to contribute to that work to reach net zero. And there are things that government needs to do that. Yes.
Thank you. She's making an excellent speech, and I completely agree with her on the need to keep focused on the pathway to net zero. As a member of the Select Committee, one of the things that we are told is most vital in that pathway is unlocking the grid and making faster approvals for new energy schemes to come onto our grid. So does she welcome what there was in the humble address about the need to transform the speed at which new decisions can be made about new power coming onto our grid?
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. She's absolutely right. Getting those grid connections right, making it easier and faster for people to be able to make those grid connections is critical for us reaching that net zero. And I'm pleased that the reform of grid connections was in the King's Speech, and we wait to hear, I think, what the Chancellor and the Secretary of State will be moving forward in relation to the details on that. But there is one other aspect of the move to the green economy that I think the government needs to address now and not in 10 years' time when the Advanced British Standard comes on board. and that is the green skills agenda.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that young people of today are being trained in the skills that are needed for the green economy, and we need to ensure that people in work already are being retrained. So gas engineers need to be retrained to deliver heat pumps, for example. There are many areas where we need to make sure that we have a workforce that is fully trained to meet the needs of that new economy. And I would hope that the government is going to press the accelerator on that in the future. I'm being inundated, but I give way over there first and then I'll give this way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Lady is making a most interesting contribution. In years gone by, we had the skills to construct massive structures for the North Sea. And we can pass these skills on to the next generation, then they can contribute to the green economy. The trouble is that the people who did this in the past are getting old and getting near retirement, so surely time is of the essence.
The Honourable Gentleman has made an important point. I think time is of the essence anyway, regardless of whether we're looking at people who have had those skills in the past. I think we need to make sure that we are changing and looking at our training in skills, but also our education system, to make sure that it is training people up for these future requirements.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. I'm sure she'll be pleased to know that in Scarborough, part of our town deal was a green construction skills visit, where already